Welcome, everybody, to Dungeon Brew. Today we're going to be talking about the genre of grimdark fantasy. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
Hey, everyone. Today we're talking about grimdark fantasy. We've already done a video about dark fantasy. This video is going to deal specifically with grimdark and maybe some of the differences that exist between it and dark fantasy, just to provide some contrast. We thought it would be helpful to see these two videos kind of in conjunction with each other because I know there's a lot of confusion that exists between how dark fantasy differs from grimdark fantasy. So, Joshua, would you please kick us off with a brief explanation of what grimdark is?
How you didn't tell me I was going to have to be brief and give you an
Okay,
explanation.
give me a very in-depth and long-winded explanation of what grimdark is.
All right, so when I think of grimdark, I've oftentimes heard it as being the opposite of noble bright. And when you think of noble bright, this is fantasy that's really has like there's the good fight worth fighting for type of thing that like comes out of Lord of the Rings, that Sam tells Frodo. It's talking about coming to happy endings and having winnable fights that you're really like rooting for the hero. So grimdark to me is like the opposite of all of that. You don't know that the fight's really worth fighting. You're just aiming for a consequence that's slightly different than the other consequence. You're not sure that every situation you're stepping into is winnable. It's bringing the horrors that you may have psychologically into reality, and it's bringing that forth for the players to experience and look at. It usually has like these bleak, pessimistic type of world views that you're stepping into. It's bloodier, it's darker. It fills your characters with this sense of darkness that's almost inescapable, not only just in the psychological presentation of the story and the game that you're telling, but in the gameplay itself, like in what it is that they're experiencing and what they're coming across.
So you talked about psychological there, and I feel like it's important maybe to differentiate between what psychological terror or psychological fear in dark fantasy is versus what psychological aspects are in grimdark. Could you expound on
Yeah.
that?
So for me, we talked about how in dark fantasy you have this psychological horror or terror that's kind of like these jump scares. It's like this sense that something could be coming around the corner at any moment.
Right.
So it's like something's always leading up to something. In a grim dark fantasy, it's just always right in front of your face and it's inescapable. You're not, in my mind, scared of what's coming around the corner. You know that something's going to be there and it is going to be graphic and in front of you, and it is going to impact essentially the next step in gameplay that might be even darker in that reality. And so it's not so much of a jump scare. It's like you're going into Saw knowing you're going to see some terrible shit. It's like going into a Saw movie and you know it's just going to be there. There's nothing you can do to get out of it. As opposed to going to something like The Sixth Sense and there might be a jump scare, but you're not sure it's really going to be that graphic.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Because for Grimdark, it's not because we talked about like supernatural type enemies, which we got into like vampires and werewolves and stuff like that, and it expands beyond that. Those are just kind of the traditional ones you would think of for supernatural. For Grimdark, you can still deal with those same enemies, but you don't have as many supernatural elements, maybe. So, talking about something like the vampire, traditionally with the vampire in something like dark fantasy, you might see the vampire, turning into a bat, and it's kind of like this Count Dracula type situation where he has his minions and other stuff. Grimdark is much bloodier. So you might deal with more of the traditional mythological style vampires where they're going through and like ripping people's throats out completely versus just having a couple of pinpricks in their throat. I think that might be a fair assessment. You can disagree with me, obviously, if you want to, but...
No, I do agree. And for me, too, in a grimdark setting, I think that your vampire creatures or race may manage an entire area of the world, or they may have an entire town to them, or they may have an entire organization that is known that is essentially embedded within that world, where in a dark fantasy one, it's like the myths of legend that you're investigating that you're not really sure if they exist or not, but you're dealing with this terrifying thing. Right. And again, you can disagree with that, but for me, the grimdark is bringing that horror to reality. It makes it real, it's there, it's inescapable. Dark fantasy, it's like it's kind of up there in the clouds. You're not really sure what exactly you're dealing with or how it's going to come in presentation to you.
Right, and I think that there's a mix maybe between these, and that's part of where the confusion comes from. Is how do those things actually get involved? How do they? How does dark fantasy differ from grimdark? And I think that there's enough bleed over between the two of these to where some of the things we were talking about, you can get away with having certain elements of both of those in either setting and still call it one or the other, but it's really where your intent is and where your themes go. So in terms of themes for grimdark fantasy, you had touched on those a little bit. Let's expand on those if you don't mind.
Sure. So for probably what you're talking about is just kind of touching on this nihilistic type of pessimistic worldview, and you're going to see this. We're going to talk about this some more, but you're going to see this through the NPCs, through the laws that are within the world, maybe even in how nature presents itself as you're walking through like a forest or through the desert or through some other landscape. Maybe the plants turn in on themselves, or it's a lot of areas where the swamps or the marshlands are reaching out, almost like the world itself is trying to engulf itself in this type of darkness and kill all life, or the opportunity for life to evolve. But it's really just these dark, like soul-stealing type of things that you're going to see throughout that kind of pull the life out of you as you're walking through the area that you're creating for your characters. Is that what you're talking about?
Well, I'm thinking, yeah, to some degree. I mean, just in terms of themes, like we talked about, like horror and psychological terror and that type of thing in dark fantasy. For grimdark, I think a lot more about it's a dystopian landscape oftentimes, which you see in a lot of fantasy. It's just whether or not you focus and capitalize on it. So even Tolkien is a dystopian landscape. The idea of the elves that came before in this kind of paradise where they were walking around and doing all of these creations, it was still coupled with the darkness of Morgoth. But in the Lord of the Rings, all of that is basically gone. The elves are leaving, the world has become darker, you no longer have the light that existed beforehand, but it is not grimdark, and it is not that type of fantasy. It's more of heroic, epic fantasy because of the way the themes come through. You could turn Lord of the Rings into a grimdark fantasy by focusing on the losses, focusing on the demons like the Balrogs and all of the orcs and the terrible stuff that they do. But because the focus is centered around the hope and the light and everything else that is, the Fellowship of the Ring and all the good things that they do, and no one dies, it becomes something that is more heroic fantasy than it is grimdark fantasy. So when we're talking about themes and you're talking about your campaign, where you choose to shift your lens and where you choose to focus determines the type of fantasy campaign or fantasy world that you're ending up creating or running.
Yeah, and that makes sense to me. I know another one of the themes that we had talked about in our original video on dark fantasy was sacrifice. We kind of built this concept around what sacrifice looks like in dark fantasy. Can you talk to us about how that would be different in a grimdark setting?
Right, so sacrifice in dark fantasy is going to be something where there probably is a loss of life to some degree. Sacrifice in grimdark tends to focus more on the amorality. It's a loss of self. It is a loss of your own innocence, your own hope, your own, feeling that there's something good in the world. And that can be done usually through the DM or the GM or by the way that they choose to present information. So you think of a bunch of moral dilemmas. Most moral dilemmas have something to do with, like, if you had a train track that was running through, and your parents were on one end or on one track, and your siblings were on the other track, which one would you choose to flip the switch? And you make that decision, and that's kind of where that moral dilemma ends. For grimdark, you play that through and you let the train hit whoever didn't get chosen, basically. And then the characters have to deal with that consequence. That is the sacrifice that you deal with most often in grimdark fantasy, is that decisions that have to be made by the characters and then dealing with the consequences that come afterwards. Those sacrifices should directly touch the characters, and they should affect the way that they view the world. And it shouldn't be something that they can just kind of brush off and be done with as soon as the question is answered. It is something they have to continue to deal with internally. And what is it that the character loses as a result of that consequence?
Yeah, I know that we've talked about this in the previous video too, is that I primarily focus on dark fantasy in my own campaigns. You do really well with Grimdark, and I think highlighting moral dilemmas as a primary aspect of Grimdark is good, because not only do you have moral dilemmas, but the moral dilemma, or the choice that you make in a moral dilemma in your campaigns frequently leads right into another moral dilemma.
Right.
Like the character knows that by making this choice, there's going to be consequences that are going to lead to another choice.
Right, that lead to consequences that lead to more choices, and which is something I enjoy dealing with a lot. And even when you end up with a situation where there isn't so much of a choice, but there's a situation. So, you've come to this point, and it's a conclusive portion of the story. There's just a consequence. There's just an action that has to be taken. Ultimately, it's like you have to deal with it in some way. Even when you achieve victory, it should be a Pyrrhic victory. There should be a situation where the characters look back on the battle that they've won and go, is it worth it? And whether that, and I'm not necessarily advocating for like party member death and stuff like that, but it is a situation where, somebody dies in the process, and then the party looks back and goes, we've lost this member of our group that's been with us since level 1. Was it worth the fight? Was it worth losing Bob because, we were able to defeat this evil? What if we just let the evil be because the evil wasn't as bad maybe as we thought it was? And that's another thing, is the amorality, the grayness that exists. There isn't so much evil as there is gray. Kind of all the way through. Like, everything is evil. The good people are evil, the bad people are evil, the bad people are good, and the good people are not. And that's how you kind of approach the world and world building too.
No, I remember having those conversations in some of your campaigns going, this is evil. It's really black, but it adds some variance of color in this gray world. Maybe we should leave it because it gives us some sense of difference. But another thing that I think we do want to talk about in regard to running Grimdark is how the magic looks like. We talked about in Dark Fantasy that magic oftentimes has a cost, and it's important to have a cost associated with that. I believe that to also be true in Grimdark.
It is.
And I also think that we had talked about in Dark Fantasy that you can sometimes adjust rules to give more cost or limit spells or types of magics that are accessible to your characters to kind of give it more of that sense of the type of genre that you're running your campaign in. This, I think, is also true in Grimdark. Picking spells that have not only a great cost, but are rather destructive, bloody, intense, powerful. Like in my mind, Grimdark campaigns have just detrimental spells that are oftentimes utilized that is dangerous to not only access, but to utilize in the course of battle. Because you may not only hurt yourself, but you might also hurt those around you, and not necessarily just your intended enemy.
Right, and it really is if you choose to go low magic, high magic, or somewhere in the middle on how powerful those spells are. But I tend to agree with you overall that that's really where it ends up being, is that the spells that exist are something that should be rare but powerful. Low magic is where I tend to go on some of that stuff. But for Grimdark, that makes sense. And the best example I can think of is in, and you'll be able to probably tell me, one of the Conan movies where Conan dies. They have to bring him back to life. In the process of doing that, they go to this witch doctor fellow who drags his soul back basically from hell, and the rest of the party spends all of their time fighting back demons in order to put his soul back into his body so that he can live. And that is the type of thing that you would see from a Grimdark, raise dead spell. It is not something that is easy. It is something where you are fighting demons and devils or some kind of darkness that is intent on keeping the soul in the afterlife. And even when it's done, it should be something where that character that comes back is not necessarily all there.
Themselves.
Yeah, it's like they raised him from the dead and soiled ground by burying him in the graveyard, and when he came back, he's not quite right. There is a consequence to that. There is something that is more than just saying, oh, we raised him from the dead, he's back and good as new.
Yeah, and one way that you can really present these types of concepts and ideas to your characters as they're moving through this world is making sure that your NPCs reflect them. Like even ideas like that on how death works and how dark the other side is or the afterlife is and what sacrifices or challenges you're going to face in this world, letting your NPCs like share their own personal stories and their own experiences in this world that you've crafted for your characters to go through, I think is a great way of presenting that information to kind of let them know what they're in for. Is there any other things that you do, I guess, with NPCs to kind of reflect that grimdark?
NPCs aren't good. At best, they have good intentions most of the time. When it comes to NPCs, and this is kind of true of me as a DM in general, but this is really resonates well within Grimdark, is that NPCs lie, NPCs have their own motivations, and NPCs are going to tell you what you want to hear or what they think you want to hear in order to get you to do the things they want you to do. There doesn't tend to be a whole lot of altruism in a grimdark fantasy when it comes to NPCs. At best, they're going to tell you what they want, and they're going to try and bribe you to get you to do the thing that they want you to do. And at worst, they're going to out and out lie to you and trick you into doing the thing that they want you to do. Like there's not really any happy medium. There's always kind of that suspicion that exists or should exist on the part of the characters. Until you get to a point where it's like you kind of understand each other. And that might be something like a follower or a hireling, where it's like you have somebody on board, they're with you, they still have their own motivations, and you guys kind of have this mercenaries trust that exists between you. It doesn't benefit either one of you to kill each other because you need each other when you get down into the dirt, but when push comes to shove, if something comes between you, then you'll do what's best for you.
Yeah, which is not to say that you won't have these types of characters populate other types of genres that you might be running within your world, but the quota that you're going to find within a grimdark setting is much higher.
Right.
For those that are just going to lie to your face and utilize you. I mean, I of course have them in dark fantasy games that I run as well, but in dark fantasy ones, just a little bit differently. My NPCs rarely outwardly just lie. They frequently tell half-truths and mislead and misdirect. So there's always some kernel of truth in what they say, but it's not the full truth of what they're saying. Where you give us NPCs that just lie straight to our face and have a very good, believable story, and we end up going sessions after sessions following them to realize that we've been bamboozled.
Right. Which I don't do all the time. I mean, I do the same thing. Lying by omission is still lying in my book. Lying with half-truths and lying by twisting the truth or providing part of the perspective, all of those things are viable methods of lying to your players.
Yeah.
They all work.
Yeah. Our problem is, John, honestly, we read way too much Robert Jordan growing up, and he taught us to write characters that lie well without knowing that they're lying.
Yeah.
So one caveat, I know we're running out of time here. I do want to say that not all players are going to like a grimdark setting.
No.
Many of them are going to like that noble bright type of like where heroes going in for the happy ending, this fight's worth fighting, and they like that feeling of, I'm going to step into this knowing I'm going to be victorious. I'm going to step into this knowing I'm fighting for good, and we're going to come out as heroes on the other end. In grimdark, oftentimes you're not going into the fight because you want to be a hero. You're not necessarily even going into the fight because you're looking for a better outcome. You're just looking for your character's outcome.
Right. And as a DM, you are just presenting problems. Like that's often how I look at it. Is I put a problem in front of my players. There isn't a right solution. There isn't a wrong solution. There are options, and they can choose whichever option they think makes the most sense to them. And oftentimes it is, the train track with the divided, rails, and whatever option they choose, there will be consequences for it, no matter what they think are going to be the consequences. Sometimes those are obvious, sometimes they're not. But as a DM, you're not really trying to make your players or your characters the hero. You're trying to see how they react when they're put in a box and they're trying to find a way out.
You put us in an escape room with no door to get out.
Right. If there is a
All
door,
right.
then it's not. There's something behind it.
All right. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with us, and we'll see you again next week.
Josh and Brew.